Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I'm very pleased to introduce this session of the round of presentation for Saturday in the Zero Symposium. And we start with Elizabeth Bolton, who from OISE, from U of T, who's talking to us about her research on how to use writing for empowerment without revisiting trauma. Enjoy the conference, the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Enrica, for the introduction. I'm so nice to be introduced by you because I was working with you on this. So I'll just go ahead and get right into it. My name is Elizabeth. For the last, actually about 7 years, I have been researching at the intersection of literacy practices and well-being. So I've been wondering things like when creative writing and short story and poetry writing actually makes us feel good about ourselves. What are those experiences like? What can I say about those experiences? Also things like reading great fiction, reading poetry, reading fairy tales. How do these things actually make our lives better, these literacy experiences? So I've been studying that, and I've mostly been using phenomenology, a lot of writing to study those experiences. Today, and I'm going to talk about how to use writing for empowerment without revisiting trauma. And this is based on literature reviews that I've done and also my own experience with writing. And I should clarify what I mean by empowerment. I'm using this sort of broadly to mean improved health, but I mean improved health in a way that doctors and even psychiatrists may find sort of difficult to address adequately. I'm talking about improvements, things like your enhanced self-knowledge, increased personal agency, enhanced resilience in the face of life's setbacks, and even sort of a stabilized groundedness in general. Writing can bring about these effects and many others. And it can do it without revisiting trauma. And why do I have to say trauma here? Well, I have to mention trauma because for about the last 40 years, the research on the link between writing and improved health has been trauma-centric. And that has been pretty much since 1986, when James Pennebaker carried out and published his first experiment on expressive writing. He was using expressive writing as a technique to help trauma victims improve their health. And what he found was replicated many times thereafter, that trauma writers followed this pattern of sort of a worse than better kind of thing. First, people reported feeling a lot worse after writing. They had faster heart rates, higher blood pressure, but in the 6 months following the writing, they experienced this phenomenon of reduced healthcare usage. So people were seeing the doctor less after they had written about the trauma. And it's kind of widely accepted now that if you're using expressive writing and it works for you, it works in that way. You get worse and then you get better. And we ignore the worse because that's in favor of the longitudinal benefits. Also very interesting from that 1986 experiment is that Pennebaker's control writers, that's those people who wrote about their shoes and the appearance of the room that they were sitting in, actually also reported feeling better after writing. There's one little sentence in that report that says that. And that's another result that we typically ignore in favor of the outcome of writing about trauma. There's really been sort of a focus on trauma as being the one thing that can affect the health, when in fact, all different types of writing are really doing something to us. And it's really just a matter of us articulating those changes or making them measurable, if that's what we're trying to do. So additionally, in 2001, Laura King updated that expressive writing paradigm where people were writing about their traumas to include positive writing. And she asked people to write about their imagined best possible future selves. And she found that people who had written about trauma and those who had written about their best possible selves both saw reduced healthcare in the 6 months after. Only the trauma writers got upset afterwards. So the kind of astonishing suggestion of that study is that Pennebaker's subjects were improving, maybe not because they had written about trauma, but in spite of it. So then the question is, what are the commonalities across trauma writing and best possible self-writing? Well, both of those types of writing are very focused. They pose a challenge. They're meaningful. They sustain the attention, these kinds of things. So then my question as a researcher was, well, what other types of writing can do that for you? And there's three that I've identified that I'm going to talk about today that do not involve revisiting trauma. So the first way that you can use writing to empower yourself is to actually use it to ground yourself through connection. And connection to what? Connection to the safety of the present moment. And that's important because for a traumatized individual, the psychic space of the past is very dangerous, and so is the psychic space of the future. And it's possible to get stuck in those spaces. So trauma therapists actually advise grounding for people suffering from distressing thoughts. And that entails choosing something from your immediate environment and establishing a connection with it. And that results in a groundedness that you can practice and benefit from mentally. So the question is, how does a writer ground herself? How do you use writing to ground yourself? Well, I take this prompt from psychotherapist and poet in residence at Mount Sinai Hospital here in Toronto, Rana Bloom. And Rana Bloom gives poetry workshops at Heart House sometimes. And this is taken from a prompt given for re-embodiment in the present moment. This is a way to use poetry to come into your body in the present moment and ground yourself. Bloom suggests choosing from your immediate environment some object that excites your senses. Maybe it's a piece of fruit or a piece of toast or your headphones nearby, something you can pick up and hold in the light and inspect and put to your cheek and smell. And starting with the words I hold, or I smell, or I remember, or any words that you like, write for 5 to 8 minutes on that object. And you may turn out a short poem, you may come out with a short paragraph, you might write a note to a friend. It doesn't matter what the product is. This is one way to use very simple, intentional, focused writing to enact a grounding experience. So that's one way to use writing to empower that doesn't involve revisiting a memory at all. Another way that you can use it to empower yourself is by focusing your intentions with writing by entering a state of flow. What is flow? Well, the person who did the very famous research on flow is named Csikszentmihalyi. It's a Hungarian name, and he published a book on this in 1990, and he wanted to know what people were doing and where they were doing it when they were living their best lives. So he found that across the board, subjects reported that they lived their best lives when they were engaged in a fluid creative state that he came to call flow. And no matter whether these people were artists or ballet dancers or athletes or rock climbers or chess players or creative writers, they really described it in the same way. They described that their thoughts were all ordered in service of some meaningful task. They described not being bothered by the distractions posed by the ego. Those kinds of things really dropped away. And they reported feeling intrinsically rewarded by the experience. They really felt that they were fully fulfilled from doing this activity and really needed little or no validation beyond the activity itself. So flow is good in the moment, and it's good if you inhabit it regularly. Csikszentmihalyi found that, happier, resilient people tend to be people who find flow somewhere in their lives. So you can use creative writing to get into a state of flow. How can you do that? Well, Peter Elbow says one way to get into that fluid creating state that feels really good is through free writing. You can try free writing, and there's only one rule for that, and that's that your hand does not stop writing. So you've just got to keep going. Elbow says free writing is not about writing, but being written. So you have this invitation to sort of let go and be written. If you're someone who has lurking trauma in your past, or just trauma that's very insistent, which I guess is all trauma, my suggestion is to narrate a memory, and narrate a memory that has the following two characteristics. I would choose a memory that is both benign and fresh. benign so that it's not harmful to you, and fresh so that your hand keeps moving, so that you can recall detail after detail after detail and make it more likely that you can enter into flow and stay there. As well, these writings about really seemingly mundane experiences can be really, really revealing and really poetic, and they make excellent phenomenological data that ends up being really valuable for that kind of research. So any way you can get into flow is helpful. Creative writing is a great way to do it. And lastly, you can use writing as a sort of parental support within a developmental context. Child psychologist Donald Winnicott stressed that play was crucial for child development, and play occurred in a bounded, safe space. The boundaries being put in place by the parents. They're there to keep the child safe so that she can play freely within safe rules. As well, within that space, children manipulate what Winnicott called transitional objects. For kids, these are toys, blankets, bottles. Winnicott said that that space for learning, that developmental creative space, still opens up for adults anytime there is a need for further integration of personality, further development, further self-knowledge. That space opens up again, usually in religious contexts or artistic contexts. So for Winnicott, in the case of a wounded adult who's writing to enhance self-knowledge, the pen and paper are your transitional objects, and the creative space is your space for developmental play. Now, since you have made those boundaries yourself and you're doing the playing inside of them, you are essentially both parent and child. And in this case, you're parenting yourself. Now, you can do this in many ways. You can write any sort of prompt that you like, but if you're someone who is suffering from intrusive thoughts and you want to make a real safe space for writing, you're going to need a special kind of prompt to do that. And I'll use a metaphor to describe that. I'm going to use the metaphor of the baby jail. The baby jail is this gated play space that I guess contemporary parents have started calling a jail, which sounds cruel, but it's far from cruel. It's actually a great kindness. Those gates are in place for the child to limit in one direction so that the space is safe, so that expansion and growth and autonomy can occur in another direction. So the limitations in one direction make the expansion in another direction possible. And that's really key, that in some cases we need limitation that permits expansion. That study in 2001 from Laura King is a great idea for a baby jail of a writing prompt, because her prompt for her best possible self writers is not one that's going to allow any of them to veer into trauma at all. So this is a prompt that's going to provide limitation, real limitation in one direction. And the point of that is to permit expansion in another. So she advised people to think about your life in the future, imagine that everything has gone as well as it possibly could. You've worked hard and succeeded. Think of this as the realization of your life dreams and write about what you imagined. Now, if you were to do this for 15 minutes at a time on 4 consecutive evenings, you might see a reduction in healthcare usage in the 6 months following. That's exactly what happened to King's writers. Now, if none of those prompts are interesting to you, don't use them, because for writing to have an empowering effect, it has to meet you at your point of need. If there's something that you need to say, something that you need to articulate that feels important to you, the writing that empowers you is going to be the writing that enables that. So here's a checklist for other types of writing. If you want writing that empowers, you might ask yourself, does this activity engage and hold my interest? Does it avoid rumination? Does it challenge appropriately? It has to be not too hard and not too easy. It's got to keep you in that space for a sustained time. Does it reward you intrinsically? Do you feel you've done something worthwhile? Does it constitute movement from chaos to order? And does it silence your ego, which is really, really important? You can note also that all of these are conditions for Csikszentmihalyi's flow state. That state is really, really important if you're trying to get therapeutic benefit from activities. So I guess the most important thing to note here is that the topic and the style and the genre that satisfies these conditions for me right now is going to be different from what satisfies them 5 hours from now, is going to be very different from what satisfies them for you today, and so on. Therapeutic writing works this way. It really meets you at a personal point. This is what I've gathered from meta-analyses that I have studied, and also from my own extensive experience with writing. So I'll share my references here, and that's it for me, and I can take some questions.